Hi, my name is Katie and I work for the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program. We are out here today at Langan Park working on these pesky apple snails. And in a little bit I will have one to show you, but basically they're called apple snails because they can get to be as large as an apple. And so what has happened is that they have completely taken over the lakes here at Langan Park. They are incredibly invasive, and the reason for this is because they have no predators here. And so what they do is they eat lots of the vegetation that's in the lakes, and they can quickly take a really nice aquatic system and turn it into an algae-based yucky system. And so what we've been out here doing is we have volunteers that you can see some of them working over there. And so we're taking long bamboo poles and we are smashing the eggs and knocking them into the water. Now the reason for this is that the apple snails have to come out of the water and lay their eggs, and then those eggs need to hatch outside of the water, and then a little baby snail crawls down the vegetation or wherever the eggs have been laid outside of the water and then goes into the water and then starts their entire life cycle. And so what we've been doing out here is, as I said, we've been smashing the eggs. The reason for that is because each of these egg clutches, is what they're called, can contain up to 2,000 eggs. So that's potentially 2,000 new snails. So let's walk over here and let's check out some of these egg clutches and see what they look like. So we'll look down. I see one right here. They're salmon colored. Can you see it right there? And so what we do is we will make sure that we smash it as much as we can, and then we just knock it into the water. And what's really important about what we're doing is that we keep track of how many of these eggs or these egg clusters that we are knocking into the water. And so we have a clicker. We're collecting data as we go. And so we'll move down here a little ways, and where there are some more of these egg clusters, and we'll go ahead and work on those. So what I like to do is just say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I know that there's 5 of them there, and I'll go ahead and smash them as much as I can. And the fresher the eggs are, the more goopy they are. And so what happens is they turn white right before they're going to hatch. So we're coming out here twice a week to smash the eggs and also collect adults while we're out here. It's really important that we come twice a week because eggs are typically laid by a female once a week, and then those eggs that they lay hatch out in about 10 days. The first ones start to hatch out, and then within that clutch, the entire rest of the clutch will have hatched out in a full 3 weeks. So it means that we need to be coming out here, and we're taking what we call a multi-pronged approach. And what we mean by this is that this is a mechanical means right here of working on the apple snails. And we also are working with Parks and Rec with the City of Mobile to manage the vegetation that's around the perimeter of the lakes. And the reason for this is because, as I mentioned, the snails need to come out of the water to lay their eggs. And just give me a second so I don't lose count real quick. So the snails have to come out of the water, and so you can see, if you look at all the plants growing around the shoreline of the lake, a lot of them have started to die back. And the reason for this is that Parks and Rec has been coming out and applying herbicides. They're applying a spray which is taken up by the plant and then starts to kill that plant. Now the roots remain there, and so the plants will eventually come back, so it's not a big deal, even though some of them are invasive anyway. But so what we're doing is then we're decreasing the opportunities for these snails to lay their eggs. And so what it does is it forces these snails to lay their eggs on these structures, and then in the center of the lake you can see there's a pretty big island. And so it's pushing a lot of the snails to start laying all around the perimeter of the island. So it basically, as we continue to have the plants die back on the shore, it's going to force a lot of the snails to start laying there, and it makes our work out here a lot easier, because then instead of having 4 or 5 people walking the shoreline, we can put those people in kayaks in the water. And the real key is to collect these adults, you've really got to be in the water. And the other very important thing to talk about is safety. So you can see I'm wearing gloves here. I've got on boots. I don't want to be working out here in open-toed shoes. The snails can carry diseases and parasites, so that's one of the reasons why we like to be safe, and we got to wear our gloves while we're out here working. But so if we can just walk down here if you want and look at some of the plants down here, and maybe we'll see an adult that we can get.
And Katie, remind us, we had somebody ask, what lake is this?
So this is Langan Park Lake. So 3 Mile Creek feeds into this lake here. And then I'm really glad that whoever asked that question, because they brought up an interesting point. So, should we let that go by? Okay. All right. Okay. So, 3 Mile Creek feeds this lake system. And then when the water leaves the lakes here where this dam is, this is 3 Mile Creek downstream. And so, right now, the snails are mostly contained in Langan Park lakes, but they have started to make their way downstream. And we really don't want them to spread downstream because, as I mentioned, like, they can completely shift an ecosystem. And so if they were to make their way into Mobile River and eventually into the Tensas Delta, it could really wreak havoc on that system. And as many of you know, the Tensas Delta is, America's Amazon. We have such species diversity there. We definitely don't want to have these snails impact that ecosystem. And so the snails have been here in Langan Park since the early 2000s. We're not 100% sure how they got here, but the thought is that we're pretty sure that they got here from aquarium releases. And so apple snails used to be sold to put in your aquariums, but what would happen is they got too big, right? I mean, I'm sure all of us that have had aquariums have had something in that aquarium that got too big, and we wondered, what do we do with it? And so our thought is that what happened is people brought their apple snails here and thought, well, we'll release it to the wild. But the problem with an invasive species like this that doesn't have any predators, now it has predators in its native habitat, which is South America, but it just doesn't have those same predators here. But so, just a couple of those snails can then just create an entire population, and that's what we've seen out here. There have been efforts through the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to eradicate these snails, but in order to fully eradicate, we really need a long-term approach. So we have grant money that we have applied for and should be on its way here. We're hoping to have those funds sometime in the next month or so. But with those grant funds, it's going to allow us to do this multi-pronged approach we do mechanically. We're going around and we're knocking the eggs into the water, smashing them as best we can, collecting the adults, but then it will allow us in the fall to follow up with copper sulfate treatments. And the copper can be lethal to the snails at a very, very low dose. And the good thing about using copper is that it doesn't harm anything else in the lake, it's just the snails. But we have to do a really, really low dose of copper because the snails are smart. And if they sense too high of a level of copper, they say, oh, danger. And they're able to close up their little operculum, their little trap door, and then they avoid that danger. And so they'll come back out after they think that it's safe again. So, which brings me to another interesting point, which is that it's mating season right now. And so that's one of the reasons why we started our efforts out here about a month ago. And so typically, the growing season is similar to plants, and so it starts in about early March or so, and then goes all the way up until November. And so that's the time when the snails are active. So that's when we want to be out here mechanically getting rid of the eggs and the adults, and then doing our copper treatments.
How fast do they reproduce?
So a snail, once it gets to be about 10 weeks of age, it can start laying eggs. So that tells us that probably around the last week of May or so will be when all of the new babies are going to start reproducing, the ones that were born at the very beginning of the season.
So how often can they lay eggs? Is it like once a year? Or
one female can lay eggs once a week.
And how many eggs can they lay? What's the average that you may, or have y'all even been able to consider that data yet?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I just know that each of the clutches that they lay can contain up to 2,000 eggs, and I would imagine when they're out laying their eggs, they are laying more than one clutch for sure. When I was out here last week, I caught 2 of them laying eggs. That's the first time I've ever been out here, and they've been laying right in front of me. So yeah, it's a fun project. And it's a learning curve. You know, we're learning just as much about these snails. We're watching them adapt to what we're doing, because right now we're the predator, you know. And so it's interesting watching their behavior change as we implement our program.
And then you said we were going to check out some of the vegetation.
Yes, let's walk down there. So I've already had volunteers that started at this end, and they worked, but you can see, I'll show you some of the eggs right here. So right here, just bright pink, so I'm just gonna knock that as best as I can into the water. But I did want to point out, like, this is, you know, we're looking for volunteers, but we're mainly looking for ones that are 16 or older, just because look how soupy this is. You know, this is, you step down and you don't expect it, but it can very quickly eat your boot. And so you can see this alligator weed right here. This is a really invasive aquatic plant that, when given the right conditions, which are like high nutrients, and then just a poor system, can really start to take over. You can see it's the chemical treatment that was done by Parks and Rec, and a big thank you to the city for partnering with us on this project. But you can see it's how much it's died back. This used to be covered in eggs, and now it's not, because the plants are dying back and they don't have anywhere to lay their eggs. So we're just going to walk over there to where all those eggs are. Eggs contain, and that's supposed to be a deterrent, but they also contain toxins, and so nothing so far that we have found eats those eggs because of those toxins. The only species that I know of that will eat the eggs are fire ants. So I can't exactly see us using fire ants to eat the eggs. So another big part of our program, our grant funds that we have, is it's invasive species management. So it's not just snails. So in last year, we completed the planning phase for our grant, and that included an entire, really very comprehensive species, entire 3-mile watershed. And so we had a group of folks out, and they sampled all the 3-mile creek and distributed invasive plants and animals. And with that list, they were able to create priority areas for us to work in. And obviously, Langan Park is a huge priority because of the apple snails. But we also have grant dollars that we will use to manage Chinese privet, Chinese tallow, and many other invasive plants that are in the watershed. So that'll be coming as well. So I'm going to work on these eggs real quick. So I'm just going to estimate real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I got about 16 here, and I'm just going to go after them. right. I got 32. I had to start counting in my head.
All in that one spot.
Yes, all in that one spot. And so, sorry. This is kind of a mix here of southern wild rice and giant cut grass. And trust me, the name means something. It will cut you up if you get close to it. But because this is like a more stout plant, this is one that they really like to lay their eggs on, because those really heavy adults can get up there and lay their eggs on these. But you can see how quickly those egg clutches add up as you're working. And so what we've seen so far is when we come out on Tuesdays and Fridays, we're generally getting about 2,500 on average egg masses or clutches for the entire perimeter and the interior of the lakes, and then collecting about 250 to 260 adults each time that we're out here. And so what we do with those adults is then we compost them when we're done. We have to make sure that they stay in the watershed. However, we decide to get rid of them because we don't want to take the chance of them spreading to another watershed and becoming invasive.
So, Katie, we're going to take a break because you're going to bring us to another